I'm going to talk to you today about responsive design. Now, before I do that, I want to give a little introduction on what responsive design is. Though I'm sure many of you already know what responsive design is, already know what it stands for, I wanted to get a definition on screen anyway. And that's responsive design is the way a website adapts to different screen sizes by reflowing and repositioning content as the available space allows. Now, we do this using media queries and flexibly sized elements, using relative minimum and maximum sizes. But more recently, we've also started using flexbox, grid, and CSS functions like clamp, min, max to make it easier to do this. But before responsive design, we did things quite differently. Back in 2008, I wrote an article on naarvoren.nl, which was a then well-known Dutch front-end website. And I spoke about handheld style sheets, because that's what we used back then. As you expect, handheld style sheets were terrible. They pretty much didn't work. There were two browsers that had support, Opera and Mobile Internet Explorer. And they supported just like the tiniest bit of CSS. Like even colors were not really a thing. But that's not why I'm not here to talk about handheld style sheets, because actually at the end of this article, I ended it with a glimmer of hope after like writing all this stuff about how essentially it doesn't work. There was a glimmer of hope, because soon we will be able to use media queries. They would allow us to respond to device widths, heights, and I really wrote this down, the number of colors on the screen. So back then, Opera 9 and Safari 3 already supported it, so that was very exciting. Of course, things have changed quite a bit since then, and responsive design is just part of the things we do. It's supported everywhere. Now, how do we do responsive design? I think we have a pretty solid shared understanding of the techniques that make up responsive design. Good responsive design is mobile first. It's built using media queries that use widths in ems so that it's relative to the content. You have a base font size of 16 pixels. So the smallest text, the smallest regular text is 16 pixels. So no more font sizes than pix on the HTML. You always allow for user resizing. So no user resize is none, or maximum scale is 1, or otherwise preventing the user from improving their experience. And of course, scrolling is fine, because there is no fault, because there are 1,000 different devices that all have a different fault. There is no fault. Now, we all know responsive design, but it's about design. And what we actually want to do is responsive websites. So, whereas responsive design focuses just on the screen that it's being shown on, responsive websites should also adapt to user preferences. And the way they do that is with user preference media queries. But also, they are a proxy of the user. The user gives their preferences, but what also helps, or what also matters, is their environment. So the device that they use is really just a proxy for them. It's one of the things that helps inform you as a builder what their experience should look like. And I think there are 4 categories. There's the user preferences, their environment, their network conditions, and their device capabilities. Today, we'll go over all of these and see what's possible in each of these categories. So not everything that I'll be talking about today will be equally well supported in all browsers. And for each feature, I'll let you know what works where. Throughout this presentation, I will use Polypane which is a web browser that I built. So if you see a weird-looking browser screenshot with multiple viewports, that's Polypane. So first up, user preferences. So there are a lot on screen right here, but half of them don't really have support. We'll go over them anyway, because they might get support someday, and then it'll be good knowledge to have. We'll start with prefers color scheme, or as everyone likes to call it, dark mode. So prefers color scheme, it indicates whether your user prefers to see a light or a dark version of your website. Now, they might prefer to see a dark version of their website because they have light sensitivity issues, or they're in a dark room, they just woke up and they're looking at their phone. Conversely, they might like to see your light mode version because they are looking at your site in bright sunlight, or usually because the light mode has more contrast. It's easier for them to read. So both of these variants can be beneficial to your visitor. To check for this, you use the prefers color scheme media query, which can be either dark or light. There used to be another option, no preference, but it turned out that no preference really meant light, because that's the default. So browsers ditched it. So it's now either light or dark. Most of you will have a website in light mode, because it's the default. And adding a dark mode from scratch can be a very big project. So if you want to add dark mode, but you don't have a lot of time, you can fake it with cheap dark mode. It works like this. First, we add a filter to the root, so that's the main element of your page. We invert all the colors, or we invert everything. And that makes everything that's dark light and light dark. Unfortunately, what this also does is invert the hue. So anything that's blue is now suddenly orange. That's not great. Not in the least, because your brand color is now destroyed. Your developer or your designer will hate you. So, also need to change the hue. And we can do that with hue rotate. So in effect, what this does is it inverts everything. It makes your website a negative. Then it rotates the hue back to the original color. So that means we end up with the original hue. And while it won't match your colors perfectly because the lightness has changed, it's probably good enough. It's cheap dark mode, it's not perfect dark mode. Now, at this point, all your images and videos will also be negative and have weird colors. So that's not great. But luckily, we can just do the same thing again. We invert the inversion, and then we rotate another 180 degrees, ending up back on 360 degrees, and your images and videos look normal again. Now at this point, if you haven't set a background color on your root, that will still be light, because the inversion works from the body and not from the root element. So you will also need to add your own specific background color. Now you could use full-on black, 000, but it's advisable to use a slightly lighter color, like 111, or something from your brand's color scheme, to make sure that there's a little color in there, that it's a little lighter. Pick one that works. So this isn't perfect, and it's definitely not as good as a fully custom theme, but it's like 7 lines of code, and it will get you something decent. So here's what that would look like. On the left is the regular site, and then on the right is the inversion. So it's not bad for a couple of lines of code. You can nitpick, like you can see that the button color is slightly different, but you know, pretty nice. So that's it for prefers color scheme. Now, with prefers reduced motion, users can indicate they want to see less stuff happening on screen. The reason they want to do this can be things like motion sickness, vestibular disorders that can cause nausea and dizziness. The animations can be distracting for them due to something like ADD, or They are developers and they just hate waiting on any fancy animation. So if a user has prefers reduced motion turned on, it doesn't mean you can't show any motion. It's reduced motion, not no motion. But you do have to be mindful. Use animation only where it helps understanding, and prefer animations that fade rather than move things. And of course, for videos like Apple, don't autoplay them. Wait for the user to initiate a video. There's two values. Either it's reduce or there's no preference. So that's pretty easy. The way to implement this, ideally, is that you consider motion to be an enhancement. You design your site without motion, and only when the user indicates they have no preference, so they don't mind motion, you add it as a progressive enhancement. Of course, if your site's already built or you have a very particular designer that definitely needs motion to convey the right feeling or whatever, you might have to flip that around, or you might have to force it. And for that, we also have cheap reduced motion. So this is very crude. It just turns off all animation. Everything that can move, it now no longer moves. You can see some weird values there, like -1 millisecond, and then a duration of 1 millisecond. For the real world, that cancels each other out. It's 0 milliseconds, nothing happens. For JavaScript, that means that it can still call an animation end and a transition end event. So if you have JavaScript that depends on animations, this will make sure that all the right calls are still being called. Now, if you do this, do go through your website to check that everything that is visible or should be visible is still visible. But, you know, again, better than nothing. You can throw this into your site right now and have a more accessible experience for your users. Of course, for video, it's not that simple, but you also want to prevent videos from autoplaying. And to do that, we need a little bit of JavaScript. In JavaScript, there's an API called the window.matchMedia API. And you can use it to check if a given media query matches using .matches. For this, you can check if reduced motion has no preference, and then if it matches, it means you can autoplay the video. At that point, you can use JavaScript to set the autoplay attribute on your video with this value. On to prefers contrast, and we'll get back to videos a little bit later. So prefers contrast indicates whether your user wants to see your site with less, more, or custom contrast. Now, let's talk about those first two. Visual impairments can make it difficult to pick up subtle differences between colors. So people that have a visual impairment will prefer a higher contrast. On the other hand, people with light sensitivity issues might benefit from less contrast. So those are the two extremes that you want to pick. This is supported across browsers, but as far as I know, only a single operating system actually has an option for it, and that operating system, macOS, only has an option to say, I want more contrast. So in the accessibility panel in the macOS settings, you can check increase contrast. And it's checked here, and you can see something interesting. Because what Mac does is not turn everything full black on full white, because it's not extreme contrast or prefer contrast all the contrast. It's prefer contrast more. And the way they do that is not just with color contrast, but also by clearly delineating the various areas. So you can see more borders. You can see that buttons are thicker. And also the colors are slightly more contrasting, but not hugely so. Now, prefers contrast custom. That's weird. Contrast is a range, like it's either more or less. There's no other option. Like I want contrast, but like it's always going to be more or less. Now, prefers contrast custom, it means something. What it used to be called was prefers contrast forced. And it would match when forced colors were active. So on Windows, you have something called Windows High Contrast Mode. On the web, we call that forced colors. And what it does is it replaces all your colors with user-specified colors. And more on that later as well, because it has its own media query. What the specifications writers thought, gosh, there's a lot of media queries, aren't there? What if we can sort of match them to give developers a general media query they can use for when people probably want to see less stuff on screen? So they call this reduced visual complexity. And by making sure that prefers contrast is true for less, more, and custom, or and forced colors, they made sure to introduce this matching media query. I think this is a very poor idea, personally, because people already don't use media queries a lot. So adding one that's kind of confusing and kind of mixes a bunch of things, not to mention that a media query that starts with prefers actually already applies something. So I'm not sure this will be picked up by developers, but we'll see. It is supported and you can use it. Now, all the previous media queries are well supported in all the modern browsers, but the next few have no or very limited support. So consider them more a preview of upcoming media features and maybe like a tiny history. First one is prefers reduced transparency. With prefers reduced transparency, users can indicate they want to see text on a more solid background. They want this usually due to visual impairments, making it hard to read text on patterned background. It gets very noisy. But it can also help people with dyslexia or concentration problems, because if there's less stuff going on, it's easier to read the text. Fortunately, this thing has no browser support at all, and also no corresponding operating system setting, because they are all dependent on the operating system. Still, in the future, it's either reduce or no preference, just like reduce motion. Again, like reduce motion, consider making the reduce situation the default. So the accessible situation is the default, and only adding visual complexity when there's no preference. Now, one last remark. This one kind of feels the same as prefers contrast, right? But wanting less transparency is not the same as wanting more contrast. They solve different issues, so you shouldn't conflate them. On to inverted colors. So inverted colors is an option that is really only supported by macOS. And on macOS, it's really only supported by Safari. The other browsers don't do anything with it. And it does what you think it does. It inverts all the colors for you. Note that it doesn't start with prefers. That's because everything that starts with prefers is something you have to do, whereas if all the other media queries are stuff that have already been done for you. Like width, it's not changeable. It's not something you have to deal with. The width is just the width. Same for inverted colors. Now, you might think that if you use this media query, that you may have to invert all the images again because they're inverted, they're super ugly. We need to invert them back to make sure that the images are still okay. But you don't have to because Safari already does that for you. However, if you look very closely, you can see the museums link up there goes from blue to orange. So what you can consider doing in the case of inverted colors is doing that U rotate shift from our cheap dark mode to make sure that your brand colors still match. So the values look like this. It's either a none or inverted. Now on the Windows side, we have forced colors. I mentioned it earlier. And forced colors maps to something called the Windows High Contrast mode. Now, Windows High Contrast mode lets users specify and override all the colors of their operating system. Usually, this ends up being a very high contrast thing, like you can see there. But a user gets to pick all the colors. So they can create a sepia theme, if that's easier for them. Or they can create like a purple on yellow theme, if they want to. So high contrast mode is a bit of a weird name, and that's why on the web we call it forced colors. Note also that this media query also doesn't start with prefers. So you don't have to do anything. The browser already did it for you. Now, a year ago, I would have told you that you needed a real physical Windows device to test forced colors, but that's not the case anymore. In Chromium-based browsers like Edge, Chrome, and yes, Polypane, you can now turn on forced color emulation. And by switching between dark and light modes, you can also test two different forced color modes, light on dark and dark on light. So this makes it really easy to test and fix your website. The nice thing about forced colors is that you can do a tiny bit of work and make your site work much better in this mode. That's because the browser essentially does all the work for you. If you compare these two, it's more or less fine, but you do miss some things, like all the backgrounds are removed. So you can see the two buttons are now just free floating text. What you can do is add a little border around them. You can add a border with a transparent color. And what happens is that you don't see them in the normal situation. But then when forced color mode is active, the border color gets excuse me, overwritten, and you can see the border. I'm going to grab some water. And we're back. Right. So, forced color mode is pretty easy. It's either off or on. And if you want to style stuff in forced color mode, you don't get to pick your own colors because they're all overwritten. So how do you define what something looks like? You get these color keywords. Because you don't know what the text of, or what the color of the text is going to be, or the background. Because the user decides. It can be black, it can be white, it can be purple. You don't know. You just have to follow the rules. So you can say, for something that is supposed to be a button, give it the color of button text and the background of button face, and then it will also always look all right. And you don't actually have to do even that, because the browser will fix that for text, for buttons, for links for you. There's one place where they won't fix it, and that's inside SVG icons. Because SVGs are usually images, so they leave the colors alone, and that can give issues. So in forced color mode, you will want to override the SVG colors if you use icons. And for that, you will want to check, is my SVG in regular text? Then it gets the canvas text color. Is it in a button? Button text. Is it in a link? Link text, etc. But that's great. You now have something that looks great in forced color mode. But what if your colors are important? Say you have a web shop and the user gets to choose the color of their t-shirt. But that's like a background image, well, background color, because that's very easy to implement. Now all the background colors are the same, so how does the user know which color t-shirt to buy? Well, you can tell the browser to leave an element alone. With forced colors, adjust none. Make sure that you use this only for the elements where your color is actually important. So don't put this on the body. It will annoy users. Don't do that. Pick the elements where the background color matters. Now, these last three options, inverted colors, prefers contrast, and forced colors, may seem very similar, but they don't serve the same purpose. Forced colors overrides all your styling to something that the user explicitly chose. So they figured out which color combinations worked the best for them. They want to see your site in their colors. With prefers contrast, it's your job to make sure that you increase or decrease the contrast. But implicitly there, the user still wants to see your colors and your design. Now, lastly, inverted colors really doesn't have a goal. It's just a feature in macOS. And honestly, it's essentially superseded by dark mode in macOS as well. It's mostly used to make screens less bright. That's the stated purpose of inverted colors on macOS. So you don't have to ascribe any meaning to that. On to some other media queries related to the environment. The light level media query lets us respond literally to the environment that a user is in. The idea is, because again, this isn't supported anywhere yet, that the operating system will tell the browser whether the environment is dark, normal, or bright, like when you're in broad daylight. And there's three values. Either the light level is normal, it's dim if it's dark, and it's washed if it's bright. Of course, operating systems already use light sensors to dim the screen and make them match the environment. So you don't have to go around dimming your website. But what you can do is adapt your site. For example, if the light level is dim, you can choose to decrease the amount of blue in your website for a more pleasant viewing experience that more properly matches like a dark environment. Blues are much brighter than reds and greens. On the other hand, if someone is in a washed situation, maybe that gray text should just be black, so that it's contrasting enough to punch through the bright sunlight. So network conditions. Not everyone is lucky enough to have fast or reliable internet or even unlimited data plans. Browsers can already send the saved data on header, and web servers can use that header to choose to send smaller images and videos, disable any form of preloading or polling. But doing this on a server is often quite hard to do. You have to really do it at an Nginx or an Apache level. And the configuration requirements for that can be just too complex, or you, as the front-end developer, simply aren't allowed to touch it. But it's unfortunate, because being able to say, website, please send me less data, can have a big impact on who gets to use your website in the first place. Coming up, and already supported behind the flag in Chromium, is the prefers reduced data media query. It lets you do essentially the same thing as the header, but right from the CSS and, in extension, the JavaScript. So ideally, you'd implement reduced data in a progressively enhanced way. So the reduced data version is the default, and then when a user essentially says, I don't care, use all my data, you add more. Unfortunately, because there is no browser support for this yet, it means that everyone everywhere will get your reduced data experience. So you probably won't be able to get that through marketing. So you have to flip it around. You have to implement your data preserving features in a prefers reduced data reduce media query. The nice thing about this is, while this won't do anything right now, it won't make your website better, also won't break it, but as support for this media query starts to land, your website will be automatically upgraded to a better experience for people with this feature on. So you can maybe already start to add this in certain places where you can get away with it. So when you get down to it, there are really 3 file types that make up the bulk of any web page: images, font files, and videos. We'll discuss strategies for each, and we'll start with fonts, because fonts are interesting. The nice thing about fonts on the web is that they're only downloaded when they actually get used. So you can define them in CSS with @fontface, and that's fine. It won't get downloaded. As soon as you use it somewhere, and there's actually text being rendered in the web page, then the browser knows, I need to download this font. So you can already have your @fontface with your fancy font, and then in the reduced data case, simply don't include it in your font family stack, and it won't get downloaded. Another quick tip, using System UI will give you the system font. So San Francisco on Mac, Segway UI on Windows. And that's usually fine, because it's the font that your user reads everything on their operating system. So they're already very familiar with it. If your font is really important, you can always choose to send like a subset of the font. For example, just for the logo, just for some branding parts. And then make sure to ship only the characters you use to make sure that everything is as small as possible. Alternatively, for the progressively enhanced version, you can add the @fontface declaration in a no preference block. What happens here is that by default, or in the reduced data case, the browser will see enter, and it'll go, I don't know this font, and go to the next one, System UI, and end up using System UI. Then, if the user has no preference for reduced data, that @fontface will get registered. The browser will recognize enter and download that instead. For background images, they tend to be large because they need to look good, but very often you can replace them with a solid color or a gradient. Then that should be your first choice, because those don't take any data. They're a few bytes at most. And you can think of background images as a way to enhance your page when the user is fine with using more data. But if that's not an option, you want to consider 3 things for your images. You want to use a modern format like WebP or AVF, or in a couple of years, JPEG XL, because they're smaller than their JPEG and PNG counterparts. And the versions of browsers that implement prefers reduced data definitely have support for these new file types. So you're safe there. Now, for a reduced data image, there are two things you can do. You can use a smaller image and blow that up, or you can use a larger image, but with a much more aggressive compression or lower quality. That won't look as good as a high-quality image, of course, but the neat thing about WebP and AVF is that their algorithms prioritize high detail areas. And that means that even with higher compression, with lower quality, high detail areas, like for example faces, still have good quality. And that means the image remains clearer. For images on the page, you can use the picture element and add a source that only matches that downloads the low quality image when the media query prefers reduced data reduce matches. So while there's no support, it just uses the image because media will be false and the source won't get downloaded. And then it will start matching once support lands and you're good to go. Now here again, you have the choice of using a smaller image or a large image with very strongly reduced quality. And you can use something like squoosh.app to find the best trade-off for an image there. There's a bunch of sliders in that app, and you can slide them around to see like what's an acceptable level of quality versus file size and make your choices there. Now, on to video. What you want to do is prevent both preloading and auto-playing video. Because generally on the web, it's a nice experience to preload a video so that by the time a person starts a video, it has already buffered and they don't have to wait. But of course, preloading means that you're already downloading part of a video that might not ever get played. And that's fine if you have no data issues, but if you have limited data, you definitely don't want to do that. Now, to implement this in a way that degrades gracefully, we need to make sure that autoplaying and preloading is off either when there is no support for prefers reduced data or there is support for prefers reduced data and it's on. So here's what that looks like. For this, we are going to use a little bit of very hacky CSS inside JavaScript. So first we need to figure out, is prefers reduced data supported? And that's pretty difficult to find out because prefers reduced data can either not match because the browser doesn't understand it, or it can not match because it's off. So you can only really know if prefers reduced data is supported if prefers reduced data reduce matches. But you can get around that with essentially this line. What it tries to say is if not reduced data or, which is the comma, reduced data, then it evaluates to true. And that means that whether or not it's turned on, as soon as it's supported, this will evaluate to true, because it's supported and either available or not available. If you want to deep dive into why this works the way it does in browsers, you can go to that link. But this way we can test if it's supported at all. Then we also want to check if there is no preference so that we can autoplay. For that, we again use window.matchMedia and then just check for prefers reduced data and no preference. Then the can autoplay and preload variable becomes either it's not supported and then we autoplay, or it is supported and the user has no preference for reduced data, and then we can also autoplay. And at that point, you set the attributes on the video, and everyone that has current browsers gets autoplaying video. Everyone that has new browsers with reduced data but not turned on gets autoplaying video. Everyone with reduced data that does want to preserve their data doesn't get autoplaying video. So as an additional note, before you autoplay videos, make sure that you also check the prefers reduced motion media query, because you also don't want to autoplay videos for people that want reduced motion. Now, onto network condition, or we can also get to prefers reduced data with the navigator.connection API. There's save data, which matches if the header is set, and there's effective type, which tells you information about the quality of the connection. So you can be on fiber, but if the latency is super high, effective type will still say slow 3G or fast 3G. So you can combine this to test for preferences to use less data, along with the prefers reduced data media query. Now, lastly, I want to talk about two relatively new things concerning the devices. The first one is the screen inset, which Apple came up with. So Apple introduced a notch because they want to optimize the screen ratio. But then if you show your website, it looks like this with these ugly borders or bands or whatever you want to call them. And that's to prevent the image from being behind the notch. So that's not great. But this isn't great either. Do we have to choose? No, you can tell your browser to take the full width with viewport fit cover in your viewport meta tag. And then Apple came up with CSS environment variables. So these environment variables will give you the safe space around the border to make sure that there's still space for the notch, but also for UI elements like that little line. And this way you can use them to make sure that your text is inset. Android phones, of course, also got notches, so they just copied this. So this also works on Android in Chrome. The only caveat is that the environment variables never include any additional padding. So if you use just the environment variables, all your text will be right next to the notch. So you'll have to use calc to add some more. Now, lastly, I want to point out the interface media queries. So these are supported across the board in all evergreen browsers. We have many different input devices nowadays compared to when the web got started. There's still a mouse, there's still a keyboard, but we now also have touch screens, we have styluses, we have external controllers like a Wii controller. We even have things like hand detection with Kinect and AR glasses. So things that are easy to do with a mouse can be much harder on other devices. Hovering might not be available. I can hold my thumb over my screen, doesn't do anything. But precisely clicking might also be very hard. If I have a Wii remote and I need to point to the television, it's much harder to click on a small target. So these media queries will let you adapt to all of these situations. What you want to do is consider touch devices as the most minimal device available. It doesn't get hover, and your input device is your thumb, which is usually bigger than a mouse. So pointing precisely at the small target probably isn't possible. So that's pointer coarse. Now, from there, devices with a stylus add precision, but still no hover, whereas a Wii controller adds hover, but no precision. And lastly, of course, a mouse or touchpad has both hover and precise clicking. So these media queries, hover and pointer, check just the primary input device, and that will never change. Even if you plug and unplug things, it's pretty static. But you can check for multiple input devices on a single computer using any hover and any pointer, and that will then match all the input devices you have available. So that's our roundup of the new and upcoming ways to adapt to user preferences, their network environment, and their device capabilities. With these, we can optimize and personalize the experience that they have with your website by responding to their preference and their wishes. I'm Kilian Valkhof. You can find me on these places, and if you want to read more, you can go to this link. Thanks for listening, and have fun at the rest of the conference.